Here at Psychology Ninjas HQ, we've decided it's the turn of learning theories and classical conditioning today. So, where do I start? Well, classical conditioning is a theory, and therefore to access our AO1 marks, we need to explain all of the key terms associated with that theory. That breaks down into these 4 concepts for the 4 marks available, with most students focusing on the process of conditioning. It's helpful to think about this as before, during, and after the learning takes place. 2 things to note here. In before conditioning, we must be specific that the neutral stimulus has no response. Otherwise, our results are inaccurate. Also, if we're talking in a fancy way, we might talk about contiguous pairing. Here what we're saying is that the unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus are paired at the same time, and you can use that instead. You'd also want to go through the other terminology associated with learning via classical conditioning, stimulus generalization, extinction, and spontaneous recovery. When we're thinking about evaluation then, and our AO3 marks, we're focusing on it's a theory, and therefore we're using the SODA approach. So when we're accessing our AO3 marks, it's really important that we give arguments and counter-arguments throughout in order to access level 3s and 4s and ensure that we've got our logical chains of reasoning. We also want to have that link sentence that's giving those mini conclusions all the way through in order to access those marks as well. So, how do we put this together into an 8 marker? Well, we've got one here. Evaluate classical conditioning as an explanation for learning. We know there's an equal weighting of marks for our explanation and our evaluation, and we need to ensure that it is balanced in that way. We suggest that you take an integrated approach, that you're doing some explanation followed by some evaluation. So you would start with the process of learning, and within that you'd have all your wonderful terminology that we've already talked about. You're then talking about the fact that there is supporting research with our example of Pavlov. Now be really careful here, we're using Pavlov for evaluation, so you just want to focus on the findings that he used classical conditioning to produce the salivation response to the bell that the dogs previously didn't have. If you're looking at going beyond that, it's a different essay and a different video. We're going to counter that in order to make sure we've got our logical chains of reasoning by saying that Pavlov over-exaggerated the need for that contiguous pairing, that the neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus had to be paired together. In fact, Rescorla suggests that consistent pairing is just as effective. What we want to make sure that we're doing is having mini conclusions throughout, and we do that through our link sentences, and here we're saying we've got external reliability, consistency in research to support that classical conditioning does explain learning. You then move on to talk about stimulus generalization and explain that as a concept, but say that classical conditioning lacks validity, lacks accuracy, because it only explains simple reflex responses, such as salivation, rather than more complex chains of behaviour, for example, aggression. Again, you'd counter that with saying that there is supporting research away from animal studies with human participants with Watson and Rayner. As we have already said with Pavlov, be really careful here to stick to those findings, and I would focus on the finding that supports stimulus generalization, in that it was more than just the white rat, but all white furry objects that Albert ended up with a fear of. Here you can also say that there is generalizability for this explanation, in that it explains both human and animal behaviour. You then move on to spontaneous recovery, suggesting here that the explanation is reductionist, that it's too simplistic for a slightly different reason here, in that it only explains direct experiences for learned behaviours, that we have to have individually a traumatic experience with something that we fear in order to explain behaviour. We have a better theory, social learning theory, that explains that it's more complicated than that. You could alternatively talk about operant conditioning here, and that classical conditioning ignores the role of motivation in learning, which is a big importance for human behaviour rather than animals. Therefore, we're having a mini conclusion once again, saying that this theory lacks accuracy to explain all behaviours. Finally, we'd move on to extinction, and here we're evaluating with our explanation of therapies, which is our application of classical conditioning to the real world. You've got a choice here in terms of either talking about systematic desensitization, which is a therapy that you've got to know anyway. So again, less detail here because that's covered in a different video. But you could talk about aversion therapy, where actually we're saying that we could pair our conditioned stimulus with something that we're unpleasant and therefore prevent behaviours. This is a really useful one in talking about social control and also the ethics of the application of psychological knowledge to society. Both are issues and debates. Again, we can extend this, talking about how Gilroy found that this application process was effective, giving our theory credibility. Okay, let's have a look at a different exam question, here for 4 marks. Because we've got the command word explain, we need to identify and justify something. Here, we're focusing on weaknesses of classical conditioning. Okay, here we've got a slightly different exam question. Still 8 marks, but we've got a discuss question. This is asking us to do 2 skills, again equally weighted for our 8 marks. One is explanation and one is application. Our explanation is of classical conditioning, so that's still our key terminology, and it's to this situation of Gloria and trying to get George to eat some vegetables. Thanks for joining us today here at Psychology Ninjas. Don't forget to like, subscribe and hit that bell. See you next time.